I last left off with Whyte's analysis of scientism, or the impulse, among the communications, public relations, and personnel men of the organization of his day to find an exact science of man whereby the conflicts between society and man could be eliminated by the process of social engineering. But what kind of society did the social engineer of the 1950s want to actually engineer? As Whyte writes, boiled down, what they ask for is an environment in which everyone is tightly knit into a belongingness with one another, one in which there is no restless wandering, but rather the deep emotional security that comes with total integration with the group. Radical? It is like nothing so much as the Middle Ages. As a quick reminder, belongingness is one of the key general features of Whyte's social ethic. The system or philosophy he believed dominated the thinking of the middle manager of the organization of the period, and to a large extent the broader middle class. And as he will address later, the fact that the social engineer associated belongingness with the Middle Ages, a period defined by rigid hierarchy, is not mere irony. Moving on, however, Whyte draws much of his conclusions about this belongingness from three figures: psychologist, industrial researcher, and organizational theorist Elton Mayo, the father of the human relations school, as Whyte labels him; Lloyd Warner, an anthropologist and former student of Mayo, and historian Frank Tenenbaum. It is the figure of Mayo from which Whyte also pulls another key component of his social ethic, the idea that there is never any real point of conflict between the individual and society, only breakdowns and communication. In introducing Mayo, however, it is important to first understand the extent to which he, in examining society and its well-being, focused on the group. To Mayo, the group was everything. Man's desire to be continuously associated and work with his fellows, he states, is a strong, if not the strongest, human characteristic. For all of us, the feeling of security and certainty derives always from assured membership of a group. Always, as in security and certainty can never come from anything else but by being part of a distinct group. Never, for example, through personal one-to-one relationships or in any individual pursuit. And thus we get a crystal clear example of how a concept such as belongingness can be used to attack individualism. You have to belong, and if you do not belong, you should be made to belong. And here we can turn back to the idea that there are no, or at least should be no, real conflicts, that anything resembling a conflict should be considered a mere breakdown in communication. According to Whyte, the likes of Mayo thought that what is needed is an administrative elite, people trained to recognize that what man really wants most is group solidarity, even if he does not realize it himself. They won't push him around. They won't even argue with him. Unfettered as they will be of prejudice and emotion, they won't have any philosophy other than cooperation to argue about. They will adjust him. Through the scientific application of human relations, these neutralist technicians will guide him into satisfying solidarity with the group so skillfully and unobtrusively that he will scarcely realize how the benefaction has been accomplished. In other words, you will be made to belong, and you will not even realize what has taken place. This sounds like nothing short of brainwashing, but, to borrow from Whyte, this is exactly the kind of approach you would expect to see justified by social engineers who view themselves as evangelists of utopia. In real-world practice, however, what Mayo advocated for was the use of non-directive counseling in the workplace, so workers could talk through their problems. As Whyte writes, the assumption was that the worker is to adjust to the group rather than vice versa, and the alternative of actually changing reality is hardly considered. If a worker is sore at his foreman, the chances are good that he is not really sore at the foreman because of some rational gripe, but is merely venting on the foreman certain repressed feelings. But listening patiently, like a psychiatrist, the counselor helps such persons understand that what they are really sore about flows from inner, subjective conflict. Characteristically, Mayo cites a woman worker who discovered for herself during an interview that her dislike of a certain supervisor was based upon a fancied resemblance to a detested stepfather. In short, in his endeavors to form more cohesive groups in the workforce, Mayo's methods actively ignored real-world conflicts between individuals and instead focused on internal psychological conflicts that could be walked through as one would with a psychiatrist or therapist. As Whyte outlines, however, the non-directive counseling system never took direct hold in America as a whole, but its techniques did, such as psychological personality testing for weeding out unqualified workers. Addressing similar issues of group cohesion, Mayo's former student, anthropologist Lloyd Werner, developed a view of American belongingness as defined by class, using anthropological tools to draw parallels between Australian Aborigines and old New England towns. He believed man's happiness in society depended on his being rooted in his class. Again, these social engineers and their call to the belongingness of the Middle Ages is not a simple matter of irony here, as Werner thought that only a certain number of people should be allowed to move from one class to another. As Whyte puts it, as too much class mobility would upset man's rootedness. The class structure would become meaningless in that case, and people would become bewildered for lack of a firm group to relate themselves to. Conflict, change, fluidity, these are the evils from which man should be insulated. Put another way, if this belongingness is supposed to be viewed as a key to the health of our society, our collective well-being is based upon you knowing your place, and you resigning yourself to the status you were born with. It doesn't get more American than that. But again, the whole point here is to recognize, if you see this mindset in our current culture, especially among our elite, either explicitly or implicitly, to understand that this kind of thinking has been around for a long time and has been a clear agenda at various junctures in our recent history. Moving on, however, Whyte adds the work of Frank Tannenbaum to the conversation here, a historian who advocated for unionization as a path toward greater belongingness. Tannenbaum saw the capacity of the union to be like a modern guild system, in which the worker, like his ancestors in the Middle Ages, will be firmly rooted in a group with customs, laws, and guides. Again, the Middle Ages are held up as the ideal, as if there were no major conflicts of interest during the time that might have upset group cohesion. And with this as the ideal, the Industrial Revolution and any concept of self-sufficiency become the evil culprits. In other words, you need a feudal lord to give you direction in life. He or she must dictate your place among the masses, and especially the workforce. And what better lord to have than a psychologist, anthropologist, historian, or other theorist playing social engineer? Or again, maybe a communications expert, or public relations, or personnel man. But as Whyte sums up, the union of Frank Tannenbaum, the community of Lloyd Werner, the corporation of Elton Mayo, each is in conflict as to which group is going to furnish the vital belongingness. And these three by no means exhaust the roster of groups proposed. Spokesmen in other areas have similarly bewailed the lack of encompassing, integrated life, and in excess of goodwill have asked that their group take over the whole messy job. Many a contemporary prescription for utopia can be summarized if you cross out the name of one group and substitute another in the following charge. Society has broken down. The family, the church, the schools, business, each has failed to give the individual the belongingness he needs, and thus it is now the task of blank group to do the job. But as Whyte adds, it is fortunate there are so many groups. With such competition for the individual psyche, it is difficult for any one of them to land the franchise. To rehash, the idea that conflicts of interest might have any place in a healthy society, or that it might be a natural product of individuals interacting with one another in the real world, is entirely dismissed. And the whole point here, from the perspective of these social engineers, is that the individual must be, to borrow from Whyte, unified with other individuals and purged of conflict at all cost. It is all about putting the group first, and the individual must, out of necessity, fall in line. The individual and his own individual needs can thus be run over roughshod. Indeed, his life is meaningless and useless if he is not wholly submitted to the group. But I will leave it off there for now, picking back up next time with a fixation on group work. I hope to see you there.